Hello, this lecture is going to be a bit shorter and is on the French Baroque as well as the Rococo. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And what you're looking at here is an example of the French Baroque. So we're going to see a couple of different styles of French Baroque. And you'll notice that this is quite different from the styles that we have seen. So we have seen the Italian Baroque with its intense drama and extremely strong shadows, the tenebrism, right? The single sources of lighting, the the people who look like they've been pulled in off the streets, to the Dutch Baroque, which is very stoic and subdued, often moralizing. Okay, so what we're looking at here is a piece by Poussin, and this is roughly 1630. This is Céline and Endymion, and this is a classical myth. Okay, so moon goddess falls in love with a shepherd, etc. And so we're seeing different parts of the story being enacted here on this screen, or this painting. And this is classicizing Baroque. It's the classical Baroque. And so that means that it's throwing back to classical times, and not in the way that other Baroque painters have thrown back to classical times with just subject matter, but this is also subject matter as well as style of depiction, etc. So one thing to understand is that the French are very regimented. And so they have a Royal Academy. And this is a school that regulates art and monitors art and artists. And this is what determines what is and is not acceptable art. Okay, so they are seeking to move the fine arts away from craft-based associations, so the guild system, which I've mentioned briefly before. And the Royal Academy is founded in 1648 by a group of artists who want to emphasize the intellectual nature of painting and sculpture, rather than seeing it as something that requires talent but is manually based, right? So the brain over brawn sort of thing. And in order to have membership in the Academy, an artist must submit a reception piece, and then they're tied to that specific genre forever. And they actually have a hierarchy of genres. So the most important is history painting, followed by portraiture, followed by landscape, and finally still life. And only the top rank, so history painters, can hold positions within the Academy. And so you can see that this is another example of Poussin, 1648, Madonna of the Steps. There was a question about who the Madonna is, and the Madonna is another term for Mary, the Virgin Mary, as the mother of Christ. And you can see how very severe and architectural and logical and mathematical, right? So this has a lot reminiscent of the Renaissance period, okay? This is another one that's very famous, in Arcadia, Ego. And this is shepherds who find this tomb, okay? And on the tomb is a phrase that says, even in Arcadia, I am to be found, and I in this case is death. So even in a very ideal place, in an idyllic landscape, death is still present, okay? So you can see how this is somewhat ponderous and it's heavy, okay? These are characteristics of Poussin's style, but still very rigid and classical. So again, more Poussin, and you can see how this really exemplifies. There are other artists in the French Baroque working, and this is Georges de la Tour, and he is working from the standpoint of Caravaggio, a follower of Caravaggio. And you can see this in the single source of light, which is very bright in some areas, and then the tenebrism surrounding, etc. Again, another example. Okay, and you can see how this is echoing Caravaggio with the darks and then the bright patches of skin looming out of the darkness, etc. So that is another flavor of the French Baroque. And this is a very somber one. This is showing hanging tree, the hanging tree. And this actually, not to make light of this at all, but this makes me think of the song in the Hunger Games. And this is a very grim look at war. And you can see that these men are condemned and they're being hanged in the tree. Okay, so moving on. What the French Baroque is most known for, however, is this sense of grandeur that is very heavy, it's very weighty. And so there's this emphasis on conspicuous consumption and showing yourself in the best light, which obviously almost all portraits do that. But this takes it to an extreme. And these tend to be very aggrandized and very weighty. They tend to have rather somber colors, a lot of gold. And so what we're seeing here is a portrait by Rococo of Louis XIV, the King of France. So this is the king who is also known as the Sun King. And he has an absolute monarchy. There are no constitutional limitations placed upon him, and he rules by divine right, which gives him the right to quash rebellions, etc. And as the Sun King, he is the center of the universe, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But he's very big on propaganda. So he has lots of large-scale projects, including Versailles, which I'll get to in just a moment. And everything about him is intended to remind the viewer of his divine right to rule and his grandeur. And this portrait would actually serve as a proxy for the king. So it would be placed over the throne. And in the king's absence, it would be placed on the throne and, on the throne, and courtiers were not allowed to turn their backs to it. So what you're seeing here is someone who is aggrandizing himself. He's trying to make himself look more important, right? And intellectual. And so what you see here is a standing portrait, which, if you remember, the Dutch Baroque does not really have many standing portraits because that is an example of pride. But here, that's not a concern. And you can see the gold color, and you can see this is ermine here. So this is a fur from an animal. The symbol of France here, he is literally embodying France. He's wrapped in its symbol. And you often have these very heavy curtains that have like satin or velvet, as well as these incredibly large, intricate wigs. Okay, so you can see just how grand his clothing is. And then he was very proud of his legs. He was a dancer in his youth, but he was short. And so he developed a fashion for these shoes in his court. Okay, and so this is very characteristic of what we think of when we say the French Baroque. We think large, okay, this is extremely large. This is at least life size. Very grand, very heavy. It's intended to make you think about the importance of this person. This is not just a nice representation. It's not like, oh, it's a cute picture of me. It is showing the grandeur of this individual. Even the size of this column back here emphasizes this. Okay, and again, you can see how this is very characteristic. This is another portrait by the same artist. But again, you can see even the figures are large. They're not overweight, but they're very connected to the earth. Okay, and you can see the aggrandizing architecture and the curtains, all of this. Okay, again, another example. All right, and you can see the very fancy wig, etc. So, Versailles. Versailles is a huge complex designed to house thousands of people. So the king would live here and he would bring his court with him. And we're talking, I believe it's about 7,000 people would come and live on the grounds. And the king's bedroom would be located right in the center here. And you can see how everything leads up to this point. Okay, the orthogonals point here, the straight lines point here. Okay, and the reason for this is that we are dealing, this is an even better image, so you can see just how sprawling this complex is. And these white bars, these are those gigantic tourist buses. And these little tiny ant dots are people. Okay, this is massive. And again, this is where the bedroom would be. It's in the center. Everything is pointing. See, look, these orthogonals basically are pointing there. And the reason for this is because Louis XIV is the Sun King. And this means that he is an embodiment of the sun. And so every day his courtiers must come and watch him wake up. Sunrise, right? And there's this whole process that he has to go through, and he has to get dressed. And it's like a super huge honor if you can hold his chamber pot, which is what he pees in. So there's this huge process. And then it's in reverse at night. They have to watch him go to sleep. Okay, and so the entire complex revolves around this one individual, this person who has the divine right to rule. Okay, so you can see just what a massive undertaking this is. And it's begun around 1669. And as you can imagine, this is extremely expensive. And eventually his descendants will have to deal with the French Revolution because there is poverty, there is famine in France, and in the meantime you have something like Versailles. But it's not just the outside that is grand, the inside is grand as well. Okay, so in the beginning of this class I had you watch the Carter's video that's filmed in the Louvre, right? And you saw how grandiose that palace was. That was, or the Louvre. So the Louvre was originally a palace for the French king. And this is done in a similar style. Okay, so you can see that there is a wall of mirrors, hence the hall of mirrors. And this is intended to make the space look even bigger than it is because the light from the windows would be reflected, opening the space up. And you can see that we have intricate ceiling paintings. Everything is coated in gold and glass. But the thing is, glass is not a cheap material at this time. Glass is quite expensive. So to have the glass for these chandeliers and the mirrors and the windows, this is a significant output of money. Okay, so you can see just how grand this really is. Apologies, my cat is sprawling on the keyboard. Okay, so this is the Royal Chapel of Versailles. Okay, so I just want you to get a sense for how extravagant this is, but everything is also tinged heavily with a sense of the importance of the person who commissioned it. Okay, so that's really important. And we're going to see that that is somewhat ignored in the next style that we're going to look at. And so the Baroque has all this color and symbolism and drama. But the next style that we look at is called the Rococo. And you can see already that there is a lot of decoration like there is in the Baroque, but it feels much less heavy. Okay, and so this emerges under the reign of Louis XV. So the son of the Sun King. That sounded really weird, but it's true. So starts in France in the early 18th, and then it spreads throughout Europe until the late 18th century. And so this is a time when painters and sculptors are moving away from the very serious, heavy, ponderous subject matter of the Baroque. And what you're going to see here is an emphasis on decoration that's characterized by lightness and pastels and grace and playfulness and intimacy and sensuousness. Okay, so you can already see this is an interior and it is extremely grand. It is very oversized. Okay, look at the size of these pillars, and there is still the use of gold, but we're seeing some drastic differences. We don't have as many of the heavy colors. It's much lighter. Okay, there's much less gold than there was in the Baroque. And you can see that there is, even in the marble that is used, right? this pastel sort of color scheme. So we're not seeing the heavy colors that we saw before. We're seeing this emphasis on playfulness and ornate decoration everywhere. Okay, so a lot of decorative arts. And this is primarily an interior design movement that is also seen in painting and sculpture and occasionally architecture. So the emphasis is on curving organic lines as opposed to stronger, more geometric lines in the Baroque. Okay, and the term was originally derogatory. So as we're going to see next week, we are in roughly the period of the Enlightenment, and this was seen as frou-frou by the Enlightenment. There's no intellectual underpinning to this. It was seen as not worthwhile, too extravagant, too wasteful, and there's no point, right? It was basically seen as pointless. So in 1720, it starts to become more unruly and more asymmetrical. And the emphasis is on arabesques. So that's kind of these graceful curves, like my hand motion is doing right now, or like you might see here, right? So this sort of a curve. In 1737, a critic calls it, quote, a ridiculous jumble of shells, dragons, reeds, palm trees, and plants, end quote, in interior. So it reaches its height in 1730 and is on the decline after that. And by decline, I mean less popularity, etc. And this is a development from, as well as a reaction to, the Baroque weightiness. So it loves the complex forms that we've seen in the Baroque, but it's moving away from the mass and the somber colors, which have been replaced with pastels, and elegance and convenience are emphasized over grandeur. And so we're moving away from the heavy classical themes. So think about the Poussin painting of the shepherds finding the grave and seeing that even in paradise, I am here, right? Death. And this is kind of the opposite. And we're going to see that this is a style that starts in France and is disseminated or spread throughout Europe. Okay, and again, you can see these curving arabesques. There's this emphasis on organic shapes and forms like leaves and vines. And so here, what you see is the sacrifice of Isaac, which should be familiar to you from the Gates of Paradise, the Quiberti image that we looked at. Okay, here's an altarpiece, but again, right, these playful colors, these pastels. Okay, much less heavy in feel than the Baroque. Okay, so this is the same church as we saw here, and this is in Germany, so it's not confined to France, 1743 to 72, and this is the Pilgrim Church. Okay. So again, this is an imperial hall in Germany, and you can see that there is this emphasis on the pastel colors, as well as light and playfulness and some gold, but it's not overpowering. And what you're going to see here, which I will hopefully be able to zoom in on soon, is that we're seeing forms from nature, like leaves and vines, okay? Scrolling, arabesques, okay? But it's much more playful than, think of Versailles, okay? And again, this is very popular in interior design. So again, right, these shells. So Rococo, the word has to do with shells themselves. And so you can see that there's a lot of this scrolling and irregular forms, okay? Very playful. So this is how it looks in interior design. And this is the ceiling. This is the Salon de les Princesses, which is in Paris. And this was built or designed in 1732. Okay, so you can see that it still has a lot of grandeur. You still have a lot of the gold, but you also have more playful elements, and it is just significantly lighter. And this is the Hall of Mirrors in the Nymphenburg Palace Park in Germany. So 1734 to 39. So you can see this lovely robin's egg blue and the mirrors like we saw in the Hall of Mirrors in Versailles. But again, this is a much, much lighter feel than Versailles. So again, it's kind of a fascinating overwrought interior decoration style. If you've ever watched Disney's animated Beauty and the Beast, when Belle is getting the tour of the castle from Cogsworth and Lumiere, he talks about the minimalist Rococo. And so you can see why that's actually a joke, because there's nothing minimalist about this. And we're going to see that these same principles are translated into painting. And so this is by Watteau, and this is from 1717. This is called The Pilgrimage to the Island of Cythera. And so we're seeing again, right, this these soft kind of rounded forms here in the trees and in the sky, but it's also much more frivolous and sensuous. Okay, so this is his reception piece for the Royal Academy, and it's categorized as a history painting, but it doesn't really fit because it's not historical, it's not religious, there's no message behind it. It actually refers to illicit sexuality. And the reason that we can tell is because we have these little cupids or putai here, okay? And so they symbolize love and affection, and you can see how the courtiers are clinging to each other, okay? It's very tender. So there are definite implications of sexuality and sensuousness. And it's this very light and frothy, that's an excellent word to describe this, frothy landscape. Okay, so this is eventually termed a fête galante, and this is an elite, elegant outdoor entertainment instead of a history painting. And so I think I may have mentioned this before, but I like to think of the Rococo kind of like an incredibly elaborate wedding cake. It's very sugary, there's a lot of frosting, there's a lot of frou-frou, very frothy, right? Lots of flowers, lots of pastel colors, and it's very extra. It doesn't need to be this way, but it is, and it can be. So this is an era of aristocratic patronage. So what we saw with Versailles and the paintings that we saw in association with Versailles are things commissioned by royalty. Okay, so there's a big difference between royalty and the aristocrats. And so this is a group of people who are less focused on presenting themselves as intellectual and having the divine right to rule a kingdom, and more focused on the pleasures of life. Okay, so even a more intellectual theme, which here you can see, this is an art dealer's store, but you can still see in the way that people are dressed and the general frothiness and the light colors, okay, that this is Rococo and not Baroque. And again, these sorts of images tend to focus heavily on pleasure. So pleasure picnics, very sensuous, this hint of illicit sexuality. This is Venus, the goddess of love, and Cupid. Okay, so that is yet another indicator that there are sexual liaisons going on. And so this is about a time when people are giving themselves over to pleasure, right? And again, this is Boucher, and Boucher is known for his very soft nudes, I suppose you could say. And I'll come back to Boucher in just a second, but this is The Swing by Fragonard. And this is from 1767 to 1768. And again, we talked about this a little bit in the beginning of the semester, but you can see these very rounded forms, the organic nature. Here we have a Cupid who is indicating that you should be quiet, i.e. there is an illicit sexual relationship going on here. And as mentioned before, She is flirting directly with the man hidden in the bushes. So there's an emphasis on vines and nature and organic forms, as well as she is flashing her lover. As mentioned, women would not wear underwear at this time. It simply wasn't feasible given the skirts and the petticoats and everything that women are dealing with. So this is very explicitly sexual, actually. And again, you can see all these little cupids, which are indicative of physical pleasure, sexuality, love, romance, etc. Okay, so I said I'd get back to Boucher, and you can see here that these are very soft figures. Okay, you can see that the flesh is just very soft and it looks very touchable. And we have these pastel colors, and this is the triumph of Venus. So we see Venus here with putai or cupids above, and the curving line of this drapery above, as well as the attendants. Okay, and you can kind of see these rosy flesh colors. And there are comments that I believe I will mention next week at the time about how Boucher is all pink bottoms and cheeks, which is not inaccurate. But okay, so we have like pearls and we have doves. It's very extra and it's very frothy. And you can see that this sort of theme was explored. This is a Poussin on the same sort of theme. This is the birth of Venus or the triumph of Neptune and Amphitrite. So again, we have the nudes, but they're not nearly as sensuous, right? So these are very sexually inviting women, okay? From the way that they are posed to the way that their flesh is presented. They look very attainable and squishy. But here in the Poussin, the women do not look like that. They are desirable, but they don't seem particularly attainable, nor do you just want to reach out and kind of squish them. But again, right, we do have similarity in subject matter and things like putai, etc. So just kind of think about the difference here. So someone who is emphasizing the intellectual aspects and is painting for more of a royal audience versus someone painting for the aristocracy and focusing solely on pleasure. So hopefully that was educational and my cat did not hinder your viewing too much. So, okay, thanks. Have a good evening, y'all.